this week, it was my birthday, and I had the idea that I wanted to create a collage birthday cake using some of my favorite decorative papers that I've created with watercolor and different techniques. So the first step was to grab my travel sketchbook and use one of the blank pages to start sketching out some ideas for how I wanted to build my collage cake. And I decided to keep it pretty simple and not even worry about perspective or depth or any of that and just go for fun, flat, bright colors. So I found a bunch of different collage papers that were some of my favorites and colors that really spoke to me and made me happy, and began trimming off the edges because I knew I was going to be cutting them down, and sometimes those borders from where I taped it kind of get in the way of seeing the possibility of the collage paper. And then I also wasn't sure if I wanted to create several mini cakes, a variety of sized cakes, or one big cake. I just wasn't sure at this point. So I began cutting out different parts of collage papers to build up different cake options as I worked my way toward what was going to become my final collage cake artwork. And a lot of these collage papers have have similar color palettes to them, even though they use different techniques for each of them. So I decided I wasn't really going to focus on the techniques working together as far as the textures I created, but focus more on colors that kind of seemed harmonious as I built up each one, and then really allowing myself to play and move back and forth between paper options for combinations for cake layers. So by this point in the decision-making process, I had several layers of a larger cake that were all part of the same collage paper, but that wasn't really where I wanted to go with it. So I still continued to go back and forth between the different papers, mixing and matching until I had a final setup that I was happy with. And then once I decided to focus on one large cake, I needed to pick my background paper. And I really loved this black and white one that I'd created a while ago. But in the end, it just kind of felt too busy. So I decided to go back to my stack of big papers and play around with some other options, experimenting with the smaller cakes on this other paper I'd created using a monoprint technique with liquid watercolor paper. But in the end, I chose this really fun green paper that I created for my sea creature collage class that I have over on Skillshare. And I decided to go with this mix of different layers of birthday cakes from birthday cake layers from different papers, from two different types of papers for the effect. And then I'm using PVA glue to paint on the back of the papers using an old acrylic brush and then attaching those to the center of my background paper. I really love using white liquid glue, whether it's PVA glue or Elmer's glue or whatever else I happen to have on hand to do my collaging, because painting it on this way gives me more control and a better adhesion than when I work with glue sticks. Although depending on the type of paper you're collaging to other paper, glue sticks can work great too. But for this entire collage, I decided to stick with painting on PVA glue. Then after I had the collage layer set, I really wanted to include some candles in some way. So I grabbed this other paper I really loved and began cutting up strips so that I could start figuring out the logistics of scale for the candles, how many candles, where to place them, so that I had those ready when I was set to do that layer of the collage project. And I set those off to the side so that I could move on to frosting my cake. And I really wanted to have the effect of the frosting dripping down from each of the layers using the same papers that I had begun working with, as well as a few others that I really loved. So I just began freeform cutting using the rough width of the cake layer, different waves and drips, and just to start to give that illusion. And at this point, I wasn't sure if I was going to go in with mixed media later. So I was a little bit mindful of trying to pick papers that matched and looked like they could work with the overall color scheme for the cake layers, but that would also give me enough contrast so that if I didn't go in with mixed media on top of it, that the collage could stand on its own. So that was kind of some of my decision-making process there. And at this stage, it was a lot of back and forth, a lot of trial and error, figuring out, what worked best, what I intuitively liked, if more layers of frosting drips were needed for each one to make it look nice and have a nice aesthetic for me, as well as to logistically work in the collage process. This frosting layer proved to be my most challenging as I was really struggling to kind of figure out what was the best option. So there's a lot of gluing down, pulling it back up, gluing it back down, cutting new pieces, and really trying to figure out what I wanted for this one as I was trying to tie the different layers together as far as what papers were used and having it all make sense and become cohesive. In the end, I'm really happy with how it turned out, but I did get to some point where I had to kind of just let it go and move on to the next layer because it just sometimes you have to do that. You got to kind of move on and let things change and shift and be very flexible and fluid and in the moment and organic with your artistic process. So by this stage, I was done with the bulk of the collage as far as the cake was concerned. I had put down my layers, I put down the frosting drips that I wanted, and now I needed to make some decisions about the candles. So I decided to thin those out and cut each of the strips into halves, and then decided those were too long, so I started trimming them down to a size that made sense with the layers of the cake and to still have of them be present. I didn't want them so small that they were kind of hard to read on the paper. And then I found some different papers that I had with yellows and light yellow oranges to start cutting out flame shapes because I did want to have my candles lit for my birthday celebration. So I just did little teardrop, esque shapes for each of the 5 candle flames. And then once I had all 5 candles and all 5 flames ready, I decided to play around with where they might go if I wanted to make more of them. But in the end, I decided that across the top of the topmost layer made the most sense. So I began gluing down the candlesticks. I did contemplate adding some melting wax strips to them, but in the end decided I would just keep it simple, even though that would have been a unified shape to add that kind of mirrored the drips of the frosting. So if you decide to make your own birthday cake, that's an option you could consider. And then I glued on the flames for the candles. I created a space in between them so that later on, after my collage was dry, I could grab an ink pen and draw in the wick connecting the flame to the candle. Made sure everything was stuck on really nice and rubbed down so that nothing was going to come off in the end. Then I wanted to add some fun confetti in the background. And I have this really beautiful paper that I've had for quite a long time. And I also had an idea that I wanted to create some sort of ground for the cake to sit on. So I began cutting this paper into strips and then playing with the idea of sort of like a woven wood grain, not wood grain, but like plank texture to the bottom, but without doing wood stuff. So that was kind of the inspiration for what becomes the ground under the cake. But for now, I'm cutting these into rectangles and gluing them down just anywhere that makes sense, just trying to kind of create some variety, but some randomness and some cohesion to the background to really add some fun pops of color on an already very color-filled space, but using blues and purples over the yellows and greens, which I really love. This was super fun as a start to confetti and wasn't part of the initial plan. It was just something that felt right in the moment, and that's generally how I love to work. I have an idea to start off with, and then the artistic process is really what leads me through a piece into the creation. So if you haven't tried working this way, I highly recommend it. It's very fun, it's very freeing, it's very low stakes. You just kind of let go and let it all happen and follow each new inspiration. So the next inspiration was that I wanted some variation to my confetti. So I remembered I had a hole puncher in my tools, so I decided to find some fun, warmer colored paper and start punching out some circles and using an old deli meat container to kind of keep the chaos of the small circles under control. And then I began gluing them down. This process was very messy. I would actually use the stickiness that was already on my finger to pick up a couple dots and then paint it directly on my finger and then start pressing it down, which is why I have that green cloth on hand in the upper right hand corner. When I'm doing a lot of collage work, I find it really helps to have a half damp, half dry cloth on hand so that I can easily clean the glue off my fingers and then wipe it dry to continue in my collage process. So if you decide to ever add confetti like this to your collage work, just embrace the sticky mess and know that you can clean it up easily enough in the end or along the way. I was really trying here to avoid creating a pattern to how the dots went down. So I was trying to kind of cluster them and space them out, but still also have a unified feel to the confetti. So it kind of felt like it was all falling down to celebrate my birthday. And then I wanted some more color variation, so I grabbed another decorative paper that I had on hand. This is actually the start of a piece from one of the classes by Denise Love that I've taken. And I loved making papers for this class because it was a fun class to take in the moment, but the extra papers also gave me some really fun collage material. So it was great to revisit this piece, and the ink work that I had done over the watercolor created really beautiful marks when I cut it up into the tiny circles, which is hard to see in this video, but anytime you can get ink work with watercolor to then be cut up and incorporated into collage works really great. So I highly recommend you experiment with that. But I used the exact same approach. I just had more circles in blues and greens and teals, this time with a little ink work on top of it to put down. Same process, lots of sticky fingers and palms, but really fun, and added a really nice variation, but also the repetition of the shape, which I really enjoyed. Then I started rummaging through some more of my decorative paper collections to try to find the last element of confetti that I wanted to add to this piece. I was trying to find some color combinations that would work with what I already had, but create a little bit of variation. So I went through a lot of options, I pondered a lot of possibilities, and in the end, I love what I chose to work with. It ended up giving some really nice variation. The paper I chose in the end was made using shaving cream marbling technique, which I really love, and the pastels provide a nice contrast to the really bold color happening everywhere else in this piece. So for this one, I cut them into strips, and then I cut them down into squarish rectangular-esque things. So I had a size variation, but I still had the geometry that mirrored the blue and purple rectangles that were the start of the confetti. And at this point, being very mindful of where they went and not going overboard with it, so they were just kind of an extra pop and a little bigger size variation compared to the circles, and smaller than the rectangles, but wider. So I think it really worked great in the end. And the lightness of that kind of also played off of some of the lighter elements in the decorative paper that I used for the cake layers and the frosting. Now it was time to figure out what to do with the bottom. So I had really loved that purple blue paper that I had found earlier that became my confetti. So I found more of those pages that I had, cut them into wider bands, cut off the white excess so that I still had a little bit of the pop of contrast, but not too much. And then began building them up like planks on, like you'd find planks, how they're kind of staggered on a wood floor or paneling. And then playing around with where the different sides met up so that it kind of made sense for the bottom. And then I just started gluing them down. I did have to do a little adjusting at the bottom when I get to the end just to make sure everything fit, but I love this. I love how this mirrors the confetti colors above, but it also pulls in some of the purple that's happening in the cake layers. And even though everything is very two-dimensional and there's no depth to this piece, I really, really love it. It has a really wonderful play of fun colors, fun techniques. It really speaks to my personality and art that makes me happy. And it was such an incredible joy to create this piece that I was super excited about. Love how it turns out. I think it's a piece that I'm most proud of in, the last bit. I just really had so much fun creating the idea, working through the process of developing it, and am so incredibly happy with how it turned out. And what a great way to spend your birthday as an artist, but to get to be in your art studio and create something that you are having oh so much fun doing. And then once I had everything glued down for the ground layer, I grabbed my scissors and I trimmed off the excess from that where it didn't line up quite with the edge of the paper. Did a little extra burnishing to ensure everything was stuck down. And here's the finished piece. I had so much fun creating this. Thanks for coming along for the ride, and I'll see you next time.